Deep in the heart of Evergreen Valley, where the whispers of aspen leaves mingled with the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, Mason Iron Hand Blackwood kept his past buried as deep as the coal he used to stoke his forge. The sound of his work echoed through the small settlement of Elk's Crossing, a remote town nestled between towering mountains, where most folks were too busy surviving to ask too many questions about the quiet blacksmith who'd appeared in their midst 5 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Few would have guessed that those calloused hands, now crafting horseshoes and mending plowshares, had once held the fastest revolvers west of the Mississippi. Even fewer would have connected the weathered face, lined with years of studying hot metal and flame, to the legendary gunslinger known as the Judge, a man whose lightning-quick draws had brought justice to the lawless territories during the bloodiest days of the frontier. The morning that would shake Elk's Crossing to its foundations began like any other, with Mason lighting his forge before dawn. The orange glow from his workshop cast long shadows across the town's single muddy street as early risers began their daily routines. Sarah Chen, who ran the general store across the way, always claimed she could set her clock by the first ring of Mason's hammer. His powerful arms, strengthened by years of metalwork, moved with practiced precision as he shaped a piece of stubborn iron into what would become a new blade for Samuel Henderson's plow. The methodical work helped quiet the memories that still haunted his dreams, memories of gun smoke and the metallic taste of fear, of split-second decisions that had sent men to their graves. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood," Tommy Chen's cheerful, a voice cut through the steady rhythm of Mason's work. The 12-year-old boy often spent his mornings watching the blacksmith work, fascinated by the way the man could bend metal to his will. "Ma says breakfast is ready if you want some." Mason set down his hammer, wiping sweat from his brow with a soot-stained forearm. "Mighty kind of her, Tommy. Let me just get this piece to cool." His voice carried the gravelly texture of someone who'd grown used to speaking just enough to get by, no more. The boy's eyes followed Mason's movements as he transferred the glowing metal to a water barrel, sending up a cloud of steam. "Could you tell me more about how you learned to work metal? Pa used to say you're the best smith he'd ever seen before he passed." Mason's expression softened at the mention of Tommy's father, James Chen, who'd been one of the first in Elk's Crossing to welcome him. "Metal's got a memory, Tommy. You've got to understand its nature, respect its stubborn ways. Bit like people. In that regard," he paused, checking the cooling blade, "your pa was a good man, knew the value of honest work." What Mason didn't say was how James Chen's acceptance had helped him believe he could truly leave his old life behind. The gunfighter known as the Judge had been famous for his unflinching sense of justice, dealing out swift verdicts to those who preyed on the innocent. But after the bloody events at Thunder Canyon, where his reputation had drawn too many young guns looking to make a name for themselves, Mason had decided the world needed fewer deadly legends and more quiet craftsmen. The morning peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Mason's hands stilled on his work, old instincts rising to the surface like creek water after rain. His keen ears, still sharp as ever, counted the hoofbeats. 5 riders, moving with the casual arrogance of men used to taking what they wanted. "Tommy," Mason said quietly, his tone carrying an authority that made the boy straighten up. "Run and tell your man to lock up the store. Then spread the word. Quiet-like. Everyone inside. Doors barred." The boy hesitated only a moment before nodding and slipping away. He'd never heard that tone in the blacksmith's voice before, but something in it demanded immediate obedience. Mason returned to his work, his movements deliberately unhurried as he studied the approaching riders through the steam rising from his quenching barrel. They were a hard-looking bunch, trail-worn and dangerous. Their leader, a tall man with A scarred face and a black duster rode slightly ahead of the others. The riders pulled up outside the smithy, dust settling around their horses' hooves. Mason noted how they spread out, an unconscious formation that spoke of experience in violence. The leader dismounted, spurs jingling against the packed earth. "You the smith?" the man asked, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that had started more than one graveyard. Mason set down his hammer carefully, positioning himself so the forge was between him and the visitors. "That I am. Name's Blackwood. Something I can help you with?" The leader's eyes narrowed, taking in the smithy with the calculated assessment of a predator. "Hear tell you're the best iron worker in these parts. Name's Rex Hawkins. My boys and we're looking to get some special work done." Mason recognized the name. Rex Rattler Hawkins, wanted in 3 territories for robbery and murder. The gang had been working their way through remote settlements, using legitimate business as cover for scouting their targets. Special work? Mason kept his voice neutral, though his fingers itched with familiar tension. The weight of his past hung heavy in the air, like the metal dust that cloaked every surface of his shop. "Need some modifications to our hardware." Hawkins patted the revolver at his hip meaningfully. "Heard you can work miracles with metal, make things more effective." Mason studied the gang leader's gun, a fine Colt modified for a hair trigger, the kind of weapon that spoke of a man's intentions as clearly as any wanted poster. "I don't do gun work anymore. Plenty of gunsmiths in larger towns who'd be happy to help." Hawkins' smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ain't asking, Smith. Way I hear it, folks around here depend on you. Be a shame if something happened to your shop. Fire's a dangerous thing, after all." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke, and Mason felt the weight of his carefully constructed piece beginning to crumble. He was acutely aware of the curious eyes watching from behind shuttered windows, of Tommy and Sarah Chen in their store across the street, of all the good people of Elk's Crossing who'd accepted him without questions about his past. "Fire is dangerous," Mason agreed, his voice taking on a quiet edge that would have warned anyone who knew his true identity. "So are assumptions about folks you don't know." One of Hawkins' men, a wiry character with a patched eye, laughed harshly. "Listen to him, Rex, trying to sound tough while he's shaking in his boots." But Hawkins was studying Mason more carefully now, something in the blacksmith's stance triggering old instincts. "You know, something about you seems familiar. Where you hold yourself. Why do you keep your right side clear?" Mason's face remained impassive, but inwardly he felt the years of peace beginning to slip away like sand through an hourglass. He'd chosen this life, this place, because it was far from the territories where the judge had made his name. But violence, like a persistent shadow, had a way of finding those who knew its dance. "I'm just a smith," Mason said, though his hand rested near the hammer on his workbench, "and I've given you my answer about gun work." The gang leader's hand drifted toward his modified Colt. "Maybe we need to help you reconsider, show you what happens to folks who don't understand the value of cooperation." Behind his shop's heavy wooden door, Mason knew his own revolvers lay wrapped in waxed cloth, untouched for 5 years. He'd sworn never to draw them again after Thunder Canyon, where 7 men had died in less than 10 seconds. Those guns, with their custom grips worn smooth by years of lightning-fast draws, were a part of his past he'd hoped to leave buried. "Town's been good to me," Mason said, his voice carrying a weight that made even Hawkins' trigger-happy men pause. "Folks here mind their own business, work hard, help each other out, don't need the kind of trouble you're offering." The one-eyed man spat in the dust. "Ain't offering trouble, old man, just making a business proposition. Way I see it, you have, 2 choices. Help us with our guns, or we start seeing how much this town really needs a blacksmith." Mason's eyes tracked each man's position with the unconscious precision of someone who'd spent years reading threats in the smallest movements. The youngest of the gang, barely more than a boy himself, was shifting nervously in his saddle. The others had spread out further, instinctively positioning themselves for violence. Through the workshop's open door, Mason could see Sarah Chen watching from her store window, her face tight with concern. She'd been the first to offer him friendship. When he'd arrived, bringing meals during his first week while he set up his forge. Her late husband, James, had helped him build this very workshop, never questioning why a simple blacksmith's hands bore the calluses of both hammerwork and gun leather. 5 years I've worked this forge, Mason said, moving with deliberate calm, to set his tools in order. Each movement was measured, precisely, the same economy of motion that had once made him legendary with a gun. Built plowshares for farmers, shoes for horses, tools for honest folk trying to make their way. Made something worth protecting. Hawkins' scarred face twisted in a smirk. Everything's worth something, Smith. Question is, what's it worth to you? Because right now, I'm looking at a town with no law, no protection, just soft people who depend on their precious blacksmith. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Mason felt something shift inside him. The carefully constructed piece of the past 5 years suddenly felt as fragile as heated glass. He'd chosen this life, this place, to escape the violence of his past, but sometimes, as he'd learned long ago, peace had to be defended. Law comes in many forms, Mason said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made Hawkins' smirk falter. Justice wears many faces. Man doesn't need a badge to stand against wrong. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gang leader's eyes narrowed, studying Mason more intently now. There was something in the blacksmith's stance, in the way his weathered hands remained perfectly steady, that tickled at old memories. Stories he'd heard around campfires, tales of a gunfighter they called the Judge, a man who could deal justice faster than the eye could follow. You know what your problem is, Smith, Hawkins said, though his hand had moved fractionally away from his gun. You talk like someone who's got something to lose. Man in your position ought to be more careful about that. Mason's response was cut short by the sound of running feet. Tommy Chen burst from between two buildings, his young face flushed with excitement. Mr. Blackwood, the telegram office. Mr. Peterson says there's news about... The boy skidded to a stop as he registered the scene before him, his eyes widening at the sight of the armed men surrounding the smithy. Mason felt his heart clench, seeing Tommy's innocent eagerness turn to fear. "Inside, Tommy," Mason ordered, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once commanded respect in the deadliest saloons of the frontier. "Your mother needs you." But Hawkins had already shifted his attention to the boy, a cruel smile playing across his scarred features. "Well now, what's the hurry, son? What kind of news is so important you came running to tell the smith?" Mason felt time slow to a crawl. As Hawkins turned his predatory attention toward Tommy, the familiar sensation washed over him, that crystalline clarity that had served him so well in countless gunfights, where every detail became sharp as broken glass. "Been hearing interesting things about Elk's Crossing," Hawkins drawled, his spurs marking lazy circles in the dust as he stepped toward Tommy. "About a smith who can work metal like magic. About a town that somehow stayed peaceful while everywhere. Else gets rougher." His eyes glinted dangerously about how no troublemakers ever seem to stick around long. Sheriff Mills, watching from his office doorway across the street, made a move to step forward, but Mason caught his eye with an almost imperceptible shake of his head. The elderly lawman was good-hearted, but no match for 5 hardened outlaws. Besides, Mills had been having trouble with his shooting arm lately, arthritis, he claimed, though Mason suspected the tremor came from an old bullet wound. "Mr. Peterson just wanted..." Tommy began, but Mason cut him off. "Tommy," he said, his voice gentle but brooking no argument, "your mother's waiting." The boy hesitated just a moment before nodding and backing away, though his worried eyes remained fixed on the scene. The one-eyed outlaw laughed harshly. "Ain't that sweet? Regular father figure, ain't you, Smith? Taking care of the whole town like they're your family." Mason's expression remained neutral, but inwardly his mind was racing through scenarios with the same tactical precision that had once made him legend. His guns were inside, but even if he could reach them, drawing iron would shatter the peaceful life he'd built. Yet watching Hawkins terrorize these people, his people now, was stirring something he'd tried hard to bury. "Town takes care of its own," Mason said evenly, moving with careful deliberation to position himself between the gang and Tommy's retreating form. "Way communities survive out here, looking out for each other." Hawkins' scarred face twisted in a mockery of understanding. "Oh, I get it. You've gone soft, Smith. Find yourself a cozy little nest, playing protector to these simple folk." He gestured expansively at the quiet buildings of Elk's Crossing. "But here's what I'm wondering. What makes a common blacksmith think he can stand up to men like us?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke, and Mason felt the weight of hidden years pressing down on him. Every face watching from behind, curtained windows, every person who'd welcomed him without questions about his past. They'd given him a chance at peace. But peace, he knew better than most, sometimes came with a price. "Experience," Mason answered simply, the word carrying layers of meaning that made Hawkins' eyes narrow. Man learns things, working metal, about patience, about knowing when something's about to break. The youngest gang member, who'd been fidgeting nervously throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut it, kid," Hawkins snapped, but his eyes never left Mason's face. "You know what else I heard about this town, Smith? Heard sometimes, late at night, someone's been practicing out in the old quarry. Real interesting sounds, like maybe someone keeping certain skills sharp." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He'd been careful, so careful, about his midnight sessions. When the weight of his past became too heavy, when his hands itched for the familiar grip of his revolvers, he'd ride out to the abandoned quarry. There, where the rock walls would swallow the sound, he'd run through the drills that had once made him the fastest gun in 3 territories. Sarah Chen had emerged onto her store's porch now, her face tight with worry. She carried herself with the quiet dignity that had helped her hold the business together after James's death, but Mason could see the fear in her eyes. Not fear for herself, he realized, but for him. "Lots of sounds in the night," Mason replied carefully. "Coyotes, wind in the rocks. Mind can play tricks. You hear what you want to hear." The one-eyed man choked and spat again, this time deliberately, close to Mason's boots. "Ain't just sounds, boss. Way he moves, seen it before. Reminds me of stories about that gunfighter, the one they called—" "That's enough, Patch." Hawkins cut him off sharply, though his expression showed he'd been thinking along similar lines. "Our friend here's just a simple blacksmith, ain't that right?" The question was a trap, and Mason knew it. Deny too strongly, and it would confirm their suspicions. Stay silent and invite more pressure. He'd faced similar moments before when his identity as the judge was at risk of exposure. But then he'd had his guns at his side and no community to protect. "Man is what he chooses to be," Mason said finally, his hands relaxed at his sides but ready. "Choices we make, work we do. That's what defines us. Not stories or suppositions." Hawkins laughed, but there was an edge to it now. "Philosophical type, ain't you? Well, here's something to philosophize about. We're going to need some work done, special modifications, like I said. And we're going to need it done quite without any fuss that might attract attention from the wrong people." "Already told you my answer about gun work," Mason replied, though he could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge. "Don't do those modifications anymore." "Anymore?" Hawkins pounced on the word like a rattler striking. "So you admit you used to do that kind of work?" Interesting slip there, Smith. Mason kept his expression neutral, but inwardly he cursed the momentary lapse. 5 years of careful peace had perhaps made him rusty at this kind of verbal sparring. Or maybe it was seeing Tommy's frightened face that had shaken his usual control. Any smith worth his salt knows how to work all kinds of metal, he deflected. But a man learns what work sits right with his conscience. The gang leader's hand drifted back to his modified Colt, fingers drumming thoughtfully on the custom grip. Conscience is a luxury, Smith. Out here, it's about survival, about taking what you want before someone else does. His voice hardened. And right now, what we want is your expertise. One way or another, a tense silence fell over the street. Even the usual morning sound seemed muted, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Mason could feel the weight of watching eyes. Sheriff Mills from his doorway, Sarah Chen from her porch, Tommy's face barely visible in the store window, and dozens of others behind shuttered windows and half-closed doors. Town's been good. To me, Mason repeated, but this time the words carried a different weight. Don't aim to bring trouble to good people's doorsteps. Trouble's already here. Hawkins smiled, showing teeth that gleamed like a wolf in moonlight. Question is, how? Much trouble these good people see depends entirely on you. As if to emphasize his point, the rest of his gang began spreading out further, taking positions that made Mason's combat-trained mind tick off potential angles of fire. The youngest one, still looking uncertain, had drifted toward the general store where Sarah stood. The message was clear. Everyone in Elk's Crossing was now a potential hostage. Been watching this town for a while now, Hawkins continued, his voice carrying the casual menace of a mountain cat playing with its prey. Interesting place. No sheriff's deputies, no hired guns, just honest folk going about their business. His eyes narrowed. And one blacksmith who seems to have an awful lot of influence for a simple craftsman. Mason felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. It was the same weight he'd carried years ago when people looked to the judge, to stand between them and chaos. But back then, he'd been a symbol as much as a man, a legend who could ride away when the gun smoke cleared. Now he had roots here, connections that ran as deep as the foundation of his forge. Mr. Blackwood, Tommy's voice came from the store, worried but trying to sound brave. Pa always said a man's got to stand for something. The boy's words, echoing his late father's wisdom, struck Mason like a physical blow. James Chen had indeed been that kind of man, one who understood that principles weren't just words to speak, but truths to live by, even die by, if necessary. The one-eyed outlaw, Patch, had been studying Mason with his single eye, as if trying to piece together a puzzle. Boss, I swear I've seen something like this before, down in Thunder Canyon years back. There was this gunfighter. Shut your mouth, Patch, Hawkins snapped, but his own expression had grown more calculating. Though now that you mention it, he took a step closer to Mason, scrutinizing him with new intensity. Thunder Canyon. Nasty business, that was. 7 men died in the time it took to blink. They say the judge did it so fast the first man was dead before the last one cleared leather. Mason kept his face impassive, but inside, the memories of that day surged up like blood from an old wound. 7 young guns, none of them older than 20, all dying to make their reputation by taking down a legend. He'd tried to warn them, tried to make them walk away. In the end, their own pride had written their epitaphs. Ancient history, Mason said quietly, though his hands had unconsciously shifted to the familiar ready position that had served him through 100 gunfights. Thunder Canyon's a long way from here. Sheriff Mills had been listening intently, and Mason saw the moment of recognition cross the old lawman's face. Mills had been younger then, serving as a deputy in a town that had occasionally crossed paths with the judge. Now, understanding dawned in his eyes as he looked at the blacksmith in a new light. Ain't so far, Hawkins mused, when you think about how stories travel, how legends seemed to cast long shadows. He gestured at Mason's forge. Must be quite a change, though, from whatever you might have been before to this. Simple life. Honest. Work. His voice took on a mocking edge. Safe. The word carried more weight than the outlaw could have known. Safety had been what Mason sought when he hung up his guns, but not for himself. He'd seen too many towns torn apart by violence, too many innocent people caught in the crossfire of reputation and revenge. The peace of Elk's Crossing had been worth every day of anonymous labor at the forge. Sarah Chen's voice cut through the tension, clear and steady despite her fear. Leave him be. Whatever you think you know about Mr. Blackwood, he's been nothing but good to this town, to all of us. Hawkins turned his predatory gaze toward her, and Mason felt his muscles coil with deadly readiness. Ma'am, it seems to me you don't know your friend here as well as you think. Man like this, carrying himself the way he does. The outlaw's hand caressed his gun's custom grip. He's got secrets that could get people killed. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a fired gun. Mason felt something shift inside him, a subtle change that those who knew his legend would have recognized as deadly dangerous. The judge had been known not for wild displays of temper, but for the deadly calm that preceded lightning-fast action. Everyone's got secrets, Sheriff Mills spoke up unexpectedly, his weathered voice carrying across the street. Question is what a man does with his past, whether he uses it to help folks or harm them. Hawkins shot the elderly lawman with an irritated glance. Ain't asking for philosophy, old man, just making sure our friend here understands his position. His attention snapped back to Mason. See, the way I figure it, a man doesn't move like you do from just hammering iron. Those calluses on your hands, they ain't all from honest forge work, are they? Mason remained silent, but his mind was racing through possibilities. His guns were wrapped in waxed cloth, hidden in a compartment beneath his workbench, 3 long strides away. The gang was spread out, but their positioning was sloppy, overconfident. If it came to violence, he cut the thought short. That way led back to Thunder Canyon, to smoking guns and dead young men who'd chosen pride over wisdom. Got some interesting information from that telegram office your young friend mentioned, Hawkins continued, a cruel smile playing at his scarred lips. About a certain retired lawman asking questions, sending messages about a man matching your description. Seems someone's mighty curious about who might be hiding out in these parts. Mason's expression didn't change, but inwardly he cursed. He'd known Marshal Durham was still hunting for the judge, driven by a mixture of professional duty and personal vendetta after Thunder Canyon. Durham had been one of the young guns' mentors, and he'd taken their deaths personally. Fascinating, as this conversation is, Mason said, his voice level, but carrying an edge that made even Hawkins' seasoned killers shift uneasily. I've got work waiting. Metal won't forge itself. The youngest gang member, still hovering near Sarah's store, suddenly called out, "Boss, someone's trying to slip out the back of the store." Hawkins' hand dropped to his gun, but Mason's voice cracked like a whip. "Inside, Sarah! Now!" The authority in his tone froze everyone for a crucial moment as Sarah Chen quickly retreated into her store. "Mighty protective of these townspeople, ain't you?" Hawkins observed, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on his gun belt. "Almost like a man with something to prove, or something to protect." Through the workshop's open door, Mason could see the corner of the oiled cloth that concealed his guns. 5 years without drawing them, but he still maintained them meticulously, another habit he'd been unable to break. Like his midnight practice sessions in the quarry, it was a compromise between the peace he sought and the skills he couldn't afford to lose. "Known men like you before," Mason said quietly, his eyes never leaving Hawkins' gun hand. "Men who mistake kindness for weakness, who thinks threatening good people makes them powerful." His voice took on a harder edge. "They all learn differently. In the end, Something in his tone made Patch, the one-eyed outlaw, take an involuntary step backward. "Boss, I'm telling you, I've heard stories about a gunfighter who talked just like that, real quiet-like, right before—" "Before what?" Hawkins snapped, though his own hand had drifted closer to his modified Colt. "Before he turned out to be just another man who bleeds like anyone else?" The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the street. In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, the sound carrying clearly in the tense silence. Mason was acutely aware of every detail: the heat from his cooling forge, the smell of coal and iron, the way Tommy's face pressed against the store window despite his mother's attempts to pull him away. "You mentioned Thunder Canyon," Mason said finally, his voice carrying the weight of memories he'd tried hard to bury. 7 young men died there, not because they had to, not because it was necessary, but because they wouldn't listen when someone tried to tell them that reputation ain't worth dying for. Hawkins' eyes widened slightly, recognition finally dawning. "Well, well. Maybe Patch here ain't as addle-minded as he looks." Starting to sound an awful lot like someone who knows more about that day than what he read in the papers. The tension in the street had reached a breaking point. Every window held watching eyes, every breath seemed held in anticipation. Mason could feel the weight of his carefully constructed piece beginning to crack like heated metal under too much strain. "Last chance," Mason said quietly, the words carrying across the morning air with the finality of a judge's verdict. "Ride out now. Find some other town, some other smith. Leave these good people to their peace." "Or what?" Hawkins challenged, though there was a new wariness in his stance. "You'll show us why no trouble ever seems to stick around Elk's Crossing? Why does a simple blacksmith practice quick draw in an abandoned quarry?" The transformation happened in the space between heartbeats. Mason's stance shifted almost imperceptibly, but suddenly the simple blacksmith seemed to evaporate like morning mist, revealing something harder, more dangerous beneath. Even Hawkins, for all his bravado, took an instinctive step back. "Been watching your work these past weeks," Mason said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once made hardened killers reconsider their choices. 3 towns raided, 2 sheriffs shot in their sleep, families driven from their homes. His eyes locked onto Hawkins with unwavering intensity. "Patterns always the same. Scout the town first, pretending to be honest travelers. Find the weak, on points. Strike when folks least expect it." Sheriff Mills had moved to the edge of his office porch, his arthritic hand resting near his gun. The old lawman's eyes showed a mix of recognition and growing amazement as he watched Mason's transformation. "Ain't denying or confirming nothing," Hawkins replied, though his casual demeanor had hardened into something more cautious. "Just here for some metal work, unless you're suggesting otherwise." A hot wind whipped down the street, carrying the scent of sage and iron from Mason's forge. The coals within still glowed orange, a reminder of the peaceful work he'd been doing just moments before. 5 years of honest labor, of reshaping both metal and himself, balanced against a lifetime of split-second decisions that had sent men to their graves. 20 years ago, Mason said quietly, I made a choice, decided to use my speed to help folks who couldn't help themselves, become something more than just another fast gun. His eyes swept over the gang members, noting their positions, their stances, their level of nervousness. Called me the judge because I gave men a choice before passing a sentence, always offered them a chance to walk away. The words hit the street like lightning strikes. Patch's remaining eye widened in recognition. The youngest gang member's face went pale. Even Hawkins' scarred features showed a flicker of uncertainty. The judge is dead, Hawkins said, but his voice lacked conviction. Disappeared after Thunder Canyon. Everyone knows that. Death's final, Mason agreed. Disappearing ain't. His hands remained relaxed at his sides, but there was a fluid readiness in his posture that spoke of countless gunfights. Been 5 peaceful years in Elk's Crossing. 5 years of honest work, good neighbors, quiet nights. Folks here gave me a chance to be more than my reputation. Sarah Chen's voice carried from her store's doorway, soft but clear. You've been protecting us all along, haven't you? All those troublemakers who suddenly decided to pass our town by. Mason didn't turn his head, keeping his eyes fixed on Hawkins' gun hand, but his voice softened slightly. Town protected itself, Sarah. I just helped remind some folks why peaceful communities are worth respecting. Tommy, who had snuck closer to the door despite his mother's protests, spoke up with boyish awe. Is it true what they say? That you're faster than lightning? That you can shoot a playing card edge on at 20 paces? Stories grow bigger than... Truth, boy, Mason replied, though his eyes never left the gang. Man's reputation starts walking ahead of him, growing with each telling. But speed ain't what matters most. It's the wisdom to know when not to draw. Hawkins' face had transformed into a mask of calculated assessment. The prospect of facing a simple blacksmith was one thing. Standing against a living legend was another. Matter entirely. His gang had spread out further, unconsciously preparing for violence, but their earlier confidence had evaporated like dew under the rising sun. Could be you're just trying to scare us, Hawkins suggested, though his hand had shifted slightly away from his gun, playing on old stories, banking on reputation instead of reality. Mason's response was to slowly roll up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of smithing work. But it wasn't the strength that caught everyone's attention. It was the scars. Thin white lines crisscrossed his skin, telling stories of close calls and desperate fights. One particularly vicious scar on his left forearm came from the notorious Carson brothers, who'd tried to ambush the judge outside of Dodge City. Neither brother had lived to regret their choice. Man's hands tell his true story, Mason said quietly. These calluses came from honest work at the forge, yes, but some marks run deeper, some skills never fade. His eyes met Hawkins with unwavering intensity. Just like some men never learn that reputation ain't worth dying for. Through the workshop's open door, the wrapped bundle containing his guns seemed to pulse with unspoken possibility. 5 years of peace, of building something meaningful, hung in the balance. But as he'd learned long ago, sometimes peace had to be defended with the very violence it sought to prevent. Got a telegram this morning, Sheriff Mills called out suddenly, his voice carrying clear authority despite his age. From Marshal Durham himself. Been tracking your gang's movement through the territory, Hawkins. 7 warrants out for your arrest, 2 for murder. The mention of Durham's name sent another ripple of tension through the street. The marshal's reputation for relentless pursuit of justice was well known, particularly when it came to gang violence. But something else caught Mason's attention. The way Hawkins' eyes had narrowed at the mention of Thunder Canyon earlier. There was recognition there and something more. Something personal. Interesting thing about Thunder Canyon, Mason said, watching Hawkins carefully. One of those 7 young guns. Name was Gabriel Hawkins. Your brother, wasn't he? The gang. Leader's face twisted with sudden fury. You shut your mouth about Gabe. You ain't got the right. Had the same look in his eyes, Mason continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. Same pride. Same refusal to walk away. Kept telling him there was no shame in choosing. Life over reputation. But he wouldn't listen. None of them would. The revelation hit the street like a physical force. Suddenly, Hawkins' presence in Elk's Crossing took on new meaning. This wasn't just about forcing a skilled smith to modify their weapons. This was about vengeance, about a brother's death that had festered into a poisonous quest for revenge. 5 years, Hawkins snarled, his calculated demeanor cracking. 5 years I've been searching for the judge, following rumors, tracking stories. All that time you've been here? playing at honest work, pretending to be just another simple craftsman. Mason's expression showed a flicker of genuine sadness. Wasn't pretending, Hawkins. Man can choose to be more than his past, more than his pain. His voice hardened slightly. Question is, can you? The gang leader's laugh was harsh and ugly. You're really going to stand there and preach about choices after what you did? 7 men dead in seconds and you talk about peace. 7 men who chose their path, Mason corrected quietly, just like you're choosing yours right now. Think about your next move real careful, Hawkins. I gave your brother a chance to walk away, giving you the same choice. The youngest gang member, barely more than a boy himself, shifted nervously in his saddle. Boss, if he really is the judge, my pa used to tell stories about him. Said he could shoot the hammer off a man's gun at 30 paces. Said he once faced down the entire Wallace gang without— Shut your mouth, Billy, Hawkins snapped, but there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. His eyes never left Mason's face, searching for confirmation of his worst fears. You want us to believe you're him, the man they called the judge? Prove it. Show us those famous guns. Don't need to prove anything, Mason replied, his voice steady as iron. Been proving who I am every day for 5 years, through honest work, through helping folks who needed it. His eyes met Sarah Chen's for a brief moment, through being part of something worth protecting. Sheriff Mills had been watching the exchange with growing understanding. Always wondered why no major trouble ever seemed to find purchase here, he said thoughtfully. Even when other towns were struggling with raiders and outlaws, folks said, "We were just lucky." He shook his head slowly. Wasn't luck at all, was it? The morning sun had climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the street. The heat from Mason's forge added to the mounting tension, making the air shimmer like the moment before a prairie storm breaks. Every window held watching faces. Every breath seemed held in anticipation of what would come next. You know what they never wrote in those dime novels, Hawkins? Mason asked, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Never mentioned how every gunfight leaves scars that go deeper than flesh. How every man I killed left behind someone like you, someone burning with grief, turned to rage. Patch, the one-eyed outlaw, had begun edging away from the confrontation, his single eye darting between Mason and the nearest escape route. Boss, if he really is the judge, maybe you ought to listen to your friend, Mason suggested quietly. Man doesn't live as long as I have in this line of work without learning to read people, see the signs. His eyes locked onto the youngest gang member. Billy, there's got doubt written all over him. Patch is already planning his exit. Even your other man, the quiet one by the water trough, he's thinking hard about his choices. Hawkins' face twisted with conflicting emotions. Gabe was 19, he ground out. 19 years old and you gunned him down like he was nothing, like all of them were nothing. Each of them had a choice, Mason responded, genuine regret coloring his voice. Same choice you have now. Walk away. Live to see another sunrise. Build something better than violence and vengeance. Tommy's voice piped up from the store entrance, carrying the innocent wisdom of youth. Like you did, Mr. Blackwood. Is that why you became a blacksmith? To build things instead of destroying them? The question hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Mason felt the weight of his past and present collide in that moment. The judge who dealt swift justice and the blacksmith who had found peace in honest work. Two sides of the same coin, perhaps, both dedicated to protecting what was right in their own ways. Something like that, Tommy, he answered, though his eyes never left Hawkins' increasingly unstable expression. Man can choose his path. Every day, every moment. Can choose to let go of the past or let it poison his future. Hawkins' hand had begun to shake slightly where it hovered near his modified Colt. You talk about choice? About letting go. 5 years I've carried the memory of identifying my brother's body. 5 years of tracking down every rumor, every whispered story about the judge's whereabouts. And now you stand there preaching peace. Peace ain't weakness, Hawkins, Mason replied. Takes more strength to walk away from a fight than to draw iron. Took me years to learn that lesson. Lost good friends along the way. Spilled blood that didn't need spilling. His voice hardened slightly. But I learned. Question is, are you smart enough to learn from your brother's mistake, or are you determined to follow his path? The tension in the street had reached a crescendo. Every creak of leather, every shift of horses' hooves, every whisper of wind carried the weight of impending violence. Mason could feel the familiar clarity settling over him, that crystalline awareness that had served him through countless gunfights. But now it was tempered by something else, the weight of the life he'd built, the connections he'd forged, the peace he'd found in shaping metal instead of taking lives. Sarah Chen stepped fully into her doorway, her voice carrying, clear and strong, across the tension-filled street. "Mr. Hawkins, your brother's death was a tragedy. But Mr. Blackwood, the judge, he spent 5 years showing us what redemption looks like, what it means to choose a better path." Redemption. Hawkins spat the word like poison. You think a man can wash away blood with honest work? Think. He can forge enough horseshoes to make up for the lives he's taken. Man can't change his past, Mason acknowledged quietly, but he can choose his future. Every swing of my hammer, every piece of metal I've shaped, they're not about washing away blood. They're about building something new, something that might help balance the scales. Sheriff Mills took a careful step forward, his aged voice carrying the weight of authority. I was there that day in Thunder Canyon, Hawkins, watching from the jail window. Saw your brother and those other young guns call the judge out. Saw him try to talk them down, try to make them understand that reputation ain't worth dying for. The revelation seemed to rock Hawkins back on his heels. You were there? Those boys wouldn't listen. Mills continued, his eyes distant with memory. Too young, too proud, too sure of themselves. The judge, Mason here, he spent nearly an hour trying to convince them to walk away. Told them about other fast guns he'd known, about how most died young and bloody. Tommy, still watching from the store entrance despite his mother's attempts to pull him back, spoke up again. Is that why you've been teaching me about metal, Mr. Blackwood? How can it be reshaped if you understand its nature? A ghost of a smile touched Mason's weathered face, though his eyes never left Hawkins' gun hand. Metal teaches patience, Tommy. Teaches you that force isn't always the answer. Sometimes you need heat, sometimes you need time, sometimes you just need to understand what you're working with. Understanding. Hawkins' laugh was bitter as winter wind. You want to talk about understanding? Try understanding what it's like to bury your little brother. Try understanding why he felt he had to prove himself against a legend. I understand better than you know, Mason replied, his voice carrying an edge of old pain. Lost my own brother to a fast gun when I was younger than your Gabe. Man named Carson thought reputation was built on how many notches he could carve in his pistol. This revelation caused a subtle shift in the morning air. Even Hawkins seemed taken aback, his revenge-driven certainty wavering for a moment. What set you on your path? The gang leader asked, genuine curiosity briefly overriding his anger. What made you become the judge? Partly, Mason admitted. Saw too many good people fall to bad men with fast guns. Decided to become something different, someone who used speed to protect, not to prove something. His eyes met Hawkins's with unwavering intensity. Someone who always gave men a choice before passing judgment. Billy, the youngest gang member, had been growing increasingly uncomfortable. Boss, maybe we should listen. If the judge is giving us a chance to ride out— Shut up, Hawkins snarled, but his voice carried an edge of desperation now. You're all being fooled by pretty words and reputation. He's just a man, a killer who got tired of killing and decided to hide behind a blacksmith's apron. Ain't hiding, Mason corrected quietly. Living, building, making something worthwhile. He gestured at his forge, where the morning's work still waited. Every piece of metal I shape helps someone. Horseshoes for traveling families, plowshares for farmers, tools for honest folk trying to make their way. Patch shifted nervously, his single eye darting between Mason and Hawkins. Boss, then stories. About the judge. They say he could read a man's intentions in his stance, say he knew when someone was going to draw before they did. Stories grow bigger than truth, Mason repeated, though there was something in his posture that made even Hawkins, hardened killers, keep their distance. But some truths are worth remembering, like how a man's choices shape more than just his own fate. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the last traces of dawn's chill. The heat from Mason's forge added to the mounting tension, making the air shimmer like the moment before a prairie storm breaks. Every window held watching faces, every breath seemed held in anticipation of what would come next. "You want to know something about your brother, Hawkins?" Mason asked softly. "Something that dime novels never mentioned? He was brave, stood his ground when his friends started having second thoughts, tried to protect the younger ones when he realized they were outmatched." A shadow crossed his weathered features. If he'd used that courage for something besides proving himself, he might have become a truly great man. The words about Gabe's courage struck Hawkins like a physical blow. His scarred face twisted with conflicting emotions, fingers flexing near his modified Colt. The gang leader's carefully maintained control was cracking, revealing the raw grief beneath his vengeful exterior. "You don't get to talk about his courage," Hawkins snarled, but there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. "You don't get to pretend you knew him." A hot wind whipped down the street, carrying the scent of sage and heated metal from Mason's forge. The coals within still glowed orange, waiting patiently for work that now seemed a lifetime away. Sheriff Mills had positioned himself carefully, his aged frame belying the tactical awareness that had kept him alive through decades of frontier law enforcement. "Known a lot of brave young men," Mason replied quietly. "Seen too many throw their lives away trying to prove something that didn't need proving." His eyes swept the gang members, noting how Billy and Patch had subtly distanced themselves from their leader. "Just like I'm watching brave men right now, trying to decide if loyalty to a wrong cause is worth dying for." The youngest gang member, Billy, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Boss, if what they say about him is true, about Thunder Canyon—" "It's all true," Sheriff Mills cut in, his voice carrying the weight of first-hand witness. "Saw him try to talk sense into those boys for nearly an hour. Saw him offer them every chance to walk away. The old lawman's hand rested near his gun, but his eyes were focused on Hawkins. Saw him mourn them after too. Each and every one." Mason felt the familiar weight of those deaths settle on his shoulders. "Every man I've killed, Hawkins, their faces stay with me, their names, their last moments." His voice hardened slightly. "But I never killed anyone who didn't choose their fate, never drew on a man who had the wisdom to walk away." Through his workshop's open door, Mason could see the hidden compartment where his guns lay wrapped in waxed cloth. 5 years of peace, yet he'd maintained them meticulously, cleaning, oiling, keeping them ready. Not out of desire to use them, but out of respect for what they represented, the last resort of a man who'd learned the true cost of violence. Sarah Chen's voice carried from her store entrance, soft but clear. "The day Mr. Blackwood arrived in Elk's Crossing, my James was still alive. He told me something about our new blacksmith that I never forgot. Said he had the hands of a craftsman, but the eyes of a man who'd seen too much death. Said maybe that's why he worked so hard to create instead of destroy." Tommy, still watching from beside his mother despite her protective grip, added eagerly, "He's been teaching me that too, about how destroying is easy, but building something takes real skill and patience." Hawkins' laugh was harsh and bitter. Pretty words from a killer playing at redemption. You think a few years of honest work erases what you are? What have you done? Nothing erases the past, Mason acknowledged, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. But a man can choose to be more than his worst days, can choose to build instead of break, to protect instead of destroy. His eyes met Hawkins with unwavering intensity. Just like you can choose right now to be more than your grief and rage. The gang leader's hand twitched closer to his gun, and Mason felt the familiar clarity descend, that crystalline awareness that had served him through countless gunfights. But now it was tempered by 5 years of peace, of learning that true strength often lay in restraint rather than action. Your brother had that same look, Mason observed quietly. That moment when pride and anger override good sense, when a man's reputation becomes more important than his life. He shifted his weight slightly, an almost imperceptible movement that nevertheless made every experienced gunman in the street tense. Difference is, Gabe was young enough to not know better. What's your excuse? The words struck home like physical blows. Hawkins' face flushed with rage, his control visibly slipping. You think you can judge me? After what you did? 7 men, dead in seconds, and now you stand there preaching about choices? 8, Mason corrected softly. The single word seemed to freeze the very air in the street. What? Hawkins faltered, thrown by the unexpected response. 8 men died that day. In Thunder Canyon, everyone remembers the 7 young guns, but they forget about Carson, the man who put them up to it, the one who convinced them that taking down the judge would make them legends. Mason's voice carried an edge of old pain. He hung back, watching from the shadows while those boys called me out, planning to finish whoever was left standing. This revelation sent a ripple through the watching crowd. Even Sheriff Mills straightened in surprise. This was a part of the story he hadn't known. Carson. Patch's remaining eye widened in recognition. Jake Carson? The gun merchant? Mason nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off Hawkins. Same man who'd killed my brother years before, who'd built his reputation selling modified guns to young men with more pride than sense. His voice hardened. Same man who'd supplied your brother's gang with their weapons, Hawkins, who'd filled their heads with tales about how the judge was getting old, getting slow. The gang leader's face showed confusion, warring with his anger. Carson, he told Gabe about you, said you needed to be taken down for the good of the frontier, said you were interfering with legitimate business. Legitimate business? Mason's laugh held no humor. Selling doctored guns to green boys, knowing the modifications would get them killed against experienced hands, profiting from death and calling it commerce. He gestured at Hawkins's modified Colt. Just like that piece you're carrying. Hair. Trigger-weighted barrel. Same modifications he sold to your brother. Modifications that got him killed when he tried to fan the hammer against a man who knew better. The morning sun caught the metal of Hawkins' gun as his hand drifted closer to it. You're lying. Carson was a friend to gunfighters. He helped us level the playing field against men like you. What did he tell you? Mason's voice carried a mixture of pity and anger. Same thing he told every young gun looking to make a name. Same lie he used to send your brother and his friends to their deaths. His eyes narrowed slightly. Ever wonder why he wasn't there that day? Why did he send 7 young men to face the judge alone? Billy, the youngest gang member, had gone pale. Boss, my gun. Carson modified it too, same as yours. Said it would make me faster. Makes you dead is what it does, Mason cut in, his voice sharp with certainty. Hair triggers misfires under pressure. Weighted barrel throws your aim when you try to fan it. He was selling death dressed up as an advantage, and he knew it. Sheriff Mills nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. Always wondered why those boys' guns seemed to fight them that day. Saw at least 3 of them try to fan their hammers and shoot wild. The revelation hit the street like a physical force. Hawkins's face showed confusion warring with long-held beliefs, while his gang members exchanged worried glances. Suddenly, conscious of the modified weapons at their hips, after the shooting stopped, Mason continued, his voice carrying the weight of memory. I found Carson trying to slip away. Had a rifle trained on the whole scene from the livery stable, planning to pick off whoever was left standing. His eyes met Hawkins directly. Man died trying to shoot me in the back, same as he lived, profiting from other men's deaths. Tommy, still watching from the store entrance, spoke up with boyish curiosity. Is that why you became a blacksmith, Mr. Blackwood? To help people understand their weapons properly. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's weathered face. Partly, boy. Metal doesn't lie, doesn't hide its nature. Work it wrong, it breaks. Work it right, it serves. His expression hardened as he turned back to Hawkins. Carson worked metal wrong, turned guns into death traps, and call it improvement. Patch had begun examining his own modified weapon with new suspicion. Boss, I've had 3 misfires with this piece since Carson worked on it. Thought I was just getting careless, but he played us all for fools, Mason said quietly, used men's pride against them. Your brother wasn't just brave, Hawkins. He was betrayed, set up to fail by a man who profited from sending young guns to their deaths. The gang leader's face had gone ashen, his hand trembling where it hovered near his gun. No, you're trying to confuse me, trying to dodge your own guilt. Think about it, Mason pressed, seeing the cracks in Hawkins' certainty. Why'd Carson disappear right after Thunder Canyon? Why'd he never tell you he was there that day? Man who claimed to be such a friend to gunfighters, who supposedly wanted to help take down the judge, why wasn't he standing with your brother when the moment came? Sarah Chen's voice carried across the tense street. The first thing Mr. Blackwood did when he came to town was fix the sheriff's gun, said it had been modified wrong, that it would get him killed if he tried to use it in a fight. Mills nodded in confirmation. Took one look at my piece and knew exactly what had been done to it. Spent 3 days rebuilding the action, wouldn't take a penny for the work. Said keeping law enforcement alive was payment enough. Because a real gunsmith knows weapons are tools, not tricks, Mason explained, his voice carrying the authority of experience. Known gunsmiths who modified weapons their whole lives, men like Samuel Chen, God rest his soul. They worked to make guns more reliable, more accurate, not these quick-draw death traps Carson was peddling. The mention of her late husband made Sarah start slightly. James always said there was more to you than metalwork, said you knew too much about guns to be just a blacksmith. Your husband was a wise man, Sarah, a true craftsman. Hawkins' hand had begun to shake where it hovered near his gun. You're saying, are you telling me Carson set Gabe up, that he knew those modifications would get him killed? He did worse than that, Mason replied, his voice heavy with old anger. He watched, stood in that livery stable with his rifle, watching those boys die. Never lifted a finger to help them, never called out a warning about their modified guns. His eyes hardened. Found his journal after. Had a list of every young gun he'd sent to their death with his improvements. Your brother's name was in the last entry. The revelation hit Hawkins like a physical blow. The gang leader staggered slightly, his face draining of color. No, you're lying. You have to be... Boss, Billy cut in, his young voice shaking. My pa, he was a gunfighter too, died in a shootout 3 years ago. His gun, Carson had worked on it just before. Mason nodded grimly. Carson kept records, detailed notes about every modification, every young gun he'd manipulated. Called it his business ledger. Found it full of names good men led to their deaths by his lies. He met Hawkins's increasingly unstable gaze. Your brother's gang wasn't the first he'd set up against me, just the last. The morning heat had intensified, making the air shimmer above the street's hard-packed earth. From his forge came the settling, sounds of cooling metal, the quiet clicks and pings that every blacksmith knew well. But Mason's attention never wavered from the increasingly volatile situation before him. "You want proof?" he asked quietly. "Draw that gun of yours. Not to fire, just draw it. Feel how the balance is wrong, how the trigger catches just before it breaks. Carson's trademark modifications." His voice carried absolute certainty. "Same ones that got your brother killed when he tried to fan the hammer." Hawkins' eyes had taken on a wild look. "Show me," he demanded suddenly. "Show me you're really him, really the judge. Prove you could have done what they say you did that day." Mason felt the weight of every watching eye, the townspeople, the gang members, Sheriff Mills with his arthritic gun hand. 5 years of peace balanced against the need to prove his identity, to make Hawkins understand the truth about his brother's death. "We've been trying to avoid this," Mason said softly, "but maybe seeing is the only way you'll believe." His eyes swept the street, marking positions, angles, threats. "Billy, that tin can by your horse's foot. Toss it up." The young gang member hesitated only a moment before complying. The can arced through the morning air, sunlight glinting off its surface. What happened next seemed to defy human limits. Mason's right hand moved in a blur of motion, too fast to follow. The wrapped bundle beneath his workbench seemed to explode. As his gun cleared leather, fired, and returned to its hiding place, all in the space of a single heartbeat. The can, still rising, spun violently as a bullet hole appeared dead center through both sides. The street went absolutely still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Hawkins' face had gone pale as death, while his gang members started in slack-jawed amazement. "That's impossible," Patch whispered. "Didn't even see him draw." "Second lesson," Mason said calmly, as if he hadn't just demonstrated speed that bordered on supernatural. "Billy, there's a playing card in your shirt pocket, the one you've been using to mark your place in that dime novel you're reading. Take it out. Hold it edge on." The young man's hands shook as he complied, holding the card up vertically. Again, Mason's draw seemed to bypass normal human limitations. The card split perfectly down its center, the two halves floating to the ground in the suddenly silent street. "Sweet Jesus," Sheriff Mills breathed. "Stories didn't do it justice." "Final lesson," Mason announced, his voice carrying clear authority. "Hawkins, look at your gun belt, the one Carson modified specially for you." The gang leader glanced down. His eyes widened as he saw the leather strap had been severed cleanly through, though he hadn't felt or heard a thing. His modified Colt slipped free, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. "3 shots," Mason explained quietly. "Each one exactly where I aimed. Could have killed you all just as easily. That's what your brother faced in Thunder Canyon. That's what Carson sent him and his friends up against, knowing they didn't stand a chance." The echoes of Mason's 3 impossible shots seemed to hang in the air like ghost notes from a forgotten song. Hawkins stared at his severed gun belt, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, rage, grief, and something newer, doubt. The carefully constructed vengeance of 5 years was crumbling in the face of undeniable truth. "Been keeping your secrets?" "2, Hawkins," Mason said quietly, breaking the stunned silence. "Telling your man you're haunting me for justice, for revenge. But that's not the whole truth, is it?" His eyes locked onto the gang leader's increasingly unstable expression. "Carson left you more than just modified guns when he died." The words hit Hawkins like physical blows. His face went from pale to ashen, hands trembling at his sides. Behind him, his gang members exchanged confused glances. "Boss?" Billy ventured hesitantly. "What's he talking about?" "Carson's ledger," Mason continued, his voice carrying across. "The morning air, the one with all his victims' names. Wasn't all he kept records of, was it? Had another book, one with names of powerful men who paid him to eliminate competition, businessmen, politicians, men who wanted certain gunfighters removed without getting their own hands dirty." Sheriff Mills straightened at this revelation, his aged face showing new understanding. That's why you've been moving from town to town, not just hunting the judge. You're running from something. A hot wind whipped down the street, carrying the scent of sage and heated metal. Through his workshop's open door, Mason could see his forge's coals still glowing orange, a reminder of the peaceful life he'd built here. But peace, he knew better than most, sometimes required confronting hard truths. Carson's real employers, Mason explained, his eyes never leaving Hawkins. They'd been hunting that second ledger since Thunder Canyon, sent men to every town where Carson had contacts, looking for anyone who might have taken possession of his papers after his death. Patch's remaining eye widened in sudden realization. That's why we never stay in one place too long. Why are we always looking over our shoulders? Shut up, Hawkins snarled, but his voice carried an edge of desperation now. You don't know what you're talking about. None of you do. Tommy, still watching from the store entrance, spoke up with the innocent insight of youth. That's why you really came to Elk's Crossing, isn't it? Not just for Mr. Blackwood. You're looking for somewhere to hide. Sarah Chen moved protectively closer to her son, but her eyes showed dawning comprehension. The questions you've been asking around town, about secret places, old mines, abandoned homesteads. You're not planning to rob us. You're looking for somewhere to stash something. Mason nodded slowly, pieces of a 5-year puzzle finally fitting together. Carson's death left you with something dangerous, didn't it, Hawkins? Something that makes you valuable to powerful men and expendable once they get what they want. The gang leader's face twisted with conflicting emotions. His hand twitched toward his fallen gun, but the memory of Mason's lightning-fast demonstration kept him from reaching for it. You don't understand, he ground out. None of you do. The men in that second ledger, they don't just kill those who cross them. They destroy everything, families, friends, whole towns if they have to. Oh, I understand, Mason replied quietly. Better than you know. Why do you think I chose this life? This place? He gestured at his forge, at the town around them. Wasn't just about finding peace. Was about building something strong enough to stand against men like that, something worth protecting. Billy, the youngest gang member, had begun to edge his horse away from his leader. All this time, we thought we were helping you avenge your brother, but we've just been running, been your shield against whoever's hunting that ledger, Hawkins. Control finally cracked. You think I wanted this? He shouted, his voice raw with suppressed emotion. Found Carson's body after Thunder Canyon, found his papers, thought I could use them to track down the judge, to get justice for Gabe. But when I read what was in that second book, he shook his head, face haunted. Names, dates, details of murders made to look like accidents or fair fights. Proof that would hang some of the most powerful men in the territory. Mason's expression showed genuine understanding. And once you knew, you couldn't unknow, couldn't walk away, because the same men who paid Carson to set up those killings, they'd never let someone with that knowledge live free. The revelation rippled through the watching crowd. Even Sheriff Mills's weathered face showed new comprehension of the drama unfolding before them. That's why you kept moving, Mason continued, his voice carrying no judgment. Why you gathered men around you, built a reputation for violence. Wasn't just about finding me, was about having enough guns at your back to keep Carson's former employers at bay. Sarah Chen's voice cut through the tension. But why come here? Why risk confronting the judge if you knew what he could do? Because Elk's Crossing is special, Mason answered for Hawkins, understanding dawning in his eyes. No railroad, no telegraph office until recently, no easy access for men with power and influence. Perfect place to hide something you don't want. Found. His gaze hardened slightly. Perfect place to make a last stand if you had to. The first sign of Drake's advance scouts came with the glint of morning sun on brass spy glasses. 2 riders, moving with military precision, appeared briefly on the ridge overlooking Elk's Crossing before melting back into the scrub brush. Mason, watching from the shadow of his workshop door, noted their positions without seeming to look. Professional. "Work," he murmured to Sheriff Mills, who had taken position behind the reinforced wall of his office. Moving like cavalry scouts, testing for reaction. The street appeared deserted now, though Mason knew better. Behind carefully prepared positions, the town waited. Billy's rifle barrel caught the sun briefly from the church tower before disappearing into shadow. Metal dust scattered strategically across the ground created patterns visible only to those who knew what to look for. A silent language of warnings and signals. "They're spreading out," Hawkins reported quietly from his position near the general store. The gang leader had traded his modified Colt for one of James Chen's properly maintained weapons. Drake always works the same way. Scouts first, then a show of force to intimidate. Only kill when people resist. Mason nodded grimly. "Counting on that. Man like Drake, he'll want to make an example. Show everyone what happens to folks who harbor his targets." His weathered hands moved with practiced ease as he made final adjustments to what appeared to be simple pieces of mining equipment positioned near his forge. Tommy's voice carried softly from the store's reinforced back room. "Mr. Blackwood, the metal channels we installed last month, they're all in position. Ma says to tell you the oil's ready too." "Good boy." Mason's approval was genuine. "You stay back there now. Your mother needs you to watch those mirror signals we talked about." The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, more distinct. Not the chaotic rhythm of ordinary riders, but the disciplined cadence of men trained to move as one. Mason could pick out subtle variations that told him exactly how Drake's force was deployed. Heavy riders on the flanks, faster horses in the center, rear guard hanging back to cut off retreat. "Clever bastard," Patch muttered from his hiding spot, his single eye narrowed. "They're not coming straight in. Moving to cut off both ends of the street first." "Course they are," Mason replied calmly. "Drake's not foolish enough to ride straight into a potential trap. He'll want to control all approaches, then send in a spokesman to make demands." His eyes met Hawkins. "Same way he did in Silver Creek and Fort Mason?" The gang leader nodded, face grim. "Offers people a choice. Hand over his target or watch their town burn. He usually sends in some smooth-talking deputy with a fake badge, acting all official-like." Mason's slight smile held no humor. "Good. Means he'll follow his pattern. Military men, they trust in what's worked before." He turned to Sheriff Mills. "Remember, let them make the first move. No matter what they say, what they threaten, we need them committed to their plan before we spring ours." The thunder of approaching horses suddenly cut off, replaced by an almost unnatural silence. Mason counted under his breath, 14 riders, just as he'd calculated from the hoofbeats. Through the strategically placed mirrors, he could track their positions without being obvious about it. "Well now," a cultured voice carried clearly down the street. "This is a peculiar welcome for law enforcement officers, wouldn't you say?" A single rider emerged from the heat haze at the street's eastern end. He sat his horse with military bearing, his black duster and silver badge catching the morning sun. Everything about him spoke of authority and legitimate power, except for his eyes. Those were killer's eyes, cold and calculating behind their facade of civility. "Name's James Drake," the man announced, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the seemingly deserted street. "Special Deputy Marshal of the Western Territories. Got warrants for some men we believe are hiding in this town." He paused for effect. "Now I can see you good folks have battened down for trouble. Understandable given the circumstances. But I'm hoping we can resolve this peacefully." Mason caught Sheriff Mills's eye and gave a slight nod. The old lawman stepped out onto his office porch, moving with the careful dignity of his position. "Mighty unusual way to serve warrants. Mills called back. 14 armed men surrounded a peaceful town. Don't recall that being standard procedure in any territory. Drake's smile never reached his eyes. Dangerous times, Sheriff. Got reports of a notorious gang in the area. The Hawkins outfit? He made a show of consulting a paper from his coat. Known killers, all of them. They might have forced their way in here, maybe taken hostages, just being cautious on behalf of public safety. Mason watched through the mirrors as Drake's men moved into their practiced positions. 2 riders had dismounted at the livery stable, presumably to check for horses that might indicate the gang's presence. Others had taken up coverage positions at key intersections, all textbook military tactics, which was exactly what Mason had been counting on. Interesting thing about public safety, Mills replied, playing his part perfectly. Usually involves proper jurisdiction. Don't recall getting any official notification about special deputy marshals operating in this territory. Drake's expression hardened slightly. Now, Sheriff, let's not get bogged down in bureaucratic details. Got dangerous men to apprehend, men who've caused good folks a lot of grief. Way I see it, you've got 2 choices here. His hand rested casually near his gun. You can help us maintain law and order, or you can be seen as obstructing justice, which would be unfortunate. Drake's controlled demeanor cracked like heated glass as he surveyed his trapped men. The practiced military precision that had served them so well in other towns had become a liability, turning their formation into a carefully orchestrated trap of Mason's design. Impressive show, Blacksmith, Drake managed, though his cultured voice carried an edge of steel now. But you've just turned a peaceful law enforcement operation into something else entirely, something that will have consequences far beyond your little town. Mason moved with deliberate calm, positioning himself where every trapped shooter could see him clearly. Always interesting the way men like you define peace. Why do you dress up threats as law, murder as justice? His eyes swept over Drake's. Increasingly agitated forces. Been watching you work for months now. 3 towns burned, 2 sheriffs' families vanished, all because they dared stand against the men you really work for. Through his network of mirrors, Mason caught Sarah Chen's signal. The ledger was secure, and the backup plan was in motion. If things went wrong here, Carson's evidence would still reach Marshal Durham's hands. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Drake warned, though his easy confidence had vanished like morning mist. The men I represent, their reach goes beyond anything you can imagine. They control judges, governors, and whole territories. Course they do, Mason agreed quietly. Men like that, they think money and influence make them untouchable. Think they can buy or bury anything that threatens. Their power. His voice hardened. But they've never faced the judge before. The words hit the street like physical blows. Several of Drake's trapped men went pale, recognition dawning in their eyes. Even their commander showed a flicker of uncertainty. The judge disappeared years ago, Drake said carefully, though his hand had drifted closer to his damaged holster. After Thunder Canyon. Everyone knows that. Disappeared, yes. Mason's slight smile held no humor. Changed, became something else, something that could be built instead of destroyed. He gestured at the town around them. Course, some skills you never really forget, like how to read men who think they're hiding their true nature behind badges. And fancy words, Tommy's voice carried from his protected position, young but steady. Mr. Blackwood's been teaching us too, about how to spot men who serve power instead of justice, about how a town can stand together against those who try to break it. Drake's laugh was sharp and ugly. Sweet sentiment, boy, but you're all about to learn a harsh lesson about how the real world works, about what happens to people who interfere with matters beyond their understanding. Understanding. Mason's voice carried the quiet authority that had once made him legend. Let's talk about understanding, about how Carson kept records of every murder your employers arranged, every payment they made, every accident they ordered. To clear their path to power, the temperature in the street seemed to drop despite the morning heat. Drake's men exchanged worried glances, their professional demeanor cracking further. That ledger died with Carson, Drake said flatly, though his eyes had taken on a hunted quality. Along with anyone foolish enough to go looking for it. You sure about that? Mason asked softly. Sure enough to bet your life, because right now, every man you brought here is trapped, every escape route is covered, and somewhere in this town, Carson's evidence is being prepared for delivery to Marshal Durham. Sheriff Mills stepped forward, his aged voice carrying clear authority. Durham's been building a case for years, gathering threads, following trails. All he needed was proof of who was really behind all these accidents and disappearances. Durham's a relic, Drake spat. A fool chasing shadows while the territory changes around him. The men I work for, they're building something bigger than his outdated ideas of justice. Building? Mason's laugh held genuine derision. You mean destroying, burning towns that won't bend to their will, murdering families who stand in their way. His eyes hardened. Using men like Carson to modify guns, ensuring young fighters died in rigged duels that served your employer's interests. Through the mirrors, Mason caught Billy's signal from the church tower, riders approaching from the east. But these weren't the reinforcements Drake had probably arranged. The dust pattern and formation spoke of lawmen, real ones, moving with a purpose. Your employers made a mistake, Mason continued, keeping Drake's attention focused on him. Got greedy, started believing their own lies about being untouchable, failed to consider that someone might be playing a longer game. Hawkins, who had been watching silently from his position, suddenly spoke up. That's why you really came to Elk's Crossing, isn't it? Not just to hide from your past, but to prepare for this moment. Mason nodded slowly. Town needed protecting, needed someone who understood how men like Drake operate, how to turn their own tactics against them. His voice carried the weight of experience. Been watching them burn communities, destroy lives, all while hiding behind false badges and corrupt authority. Drake's composure cracked further, his practiced smile replaced by something harder, more desperate. You think you're so clever, with your tricks and traps, but you've just signed this town's death warrant. The men I work for, they don't forgive. Don't forget. Like they didn't forgive Carson, Mason asked quietly. The question caused several of Drake's trapped men to start visibly. Oh yes, I know about that too. How your employers decided he'd become a liability, how they sent you to clean up their loose end at Thunder Canyon. The revelation hit the street like a thunderbolt. Even Hawkins straightened in surprise, pieces of a 5-year-old puzzle finally falling into place. Carson wasn't just watching that day, Mason continued, his voice carrying clear across the morning air. He was waiting. Had a meeting arranged with Durham's agents, was going to turn over evidence against your employers. His eyes locked onto Drake's increasingly unstable expression. But you got to him first, didn't you? Made it look like he died in the crossfire. You can't prove any of that, Drake snarled, though his hand had begun to shake where it hovered near his damaged holster. Don't have to, Mason replied calmly. Carson proved it himself. That second ledger everyone's been hunting, it's not just a list of names and crimes, it's his insurance policy. He gestured at the town around them. Every detail, every order, every payment, including the ones to you, Drake. The ones that turned you from a decorated cavalry officer into a murderer for hire, Tommy's voice carried from his protected position. The telegraph messages you had me memorize, Mr. Blackwood. They weren't just about watching for strangers, were they? They were signals to Marshal Durham. Smart boy, Mason acknowledged. Been coordinating with Durham for months, feeding him information about Drake's operations, about the men he really works for, all while making Elk's Crossing look like just another quiet town, Perfect place for men with secrets to feel safe making mistakes. Sarah Chen stepped into her doorway, rifle held ready. That's why you chose our town, isn't it? Not just because it was remote, but because it had people willing to stand together, people who could keep secrets and play their parts. Through his mirror network, Mason caught another signal from Billy. The approaching riders were less than 5 minutes out. He needed to keep Drake talking, keep him from doing anything desperate. Your employer's mistake, Mason continued, was thinking power meant the same thing as strength, thinking they could burn and murder their way to control of the territory. His voice carried the quiet authority that had once made him legend. But real strength, that comes from people standing together, from communities willing to fight for what's right. Drake's laugh was harsh and desperate. Pretty speech from a man who made his name killing people. How many men died facing the judge? How many families grieved while you rode away playing hero? Every death weighed on me, Mason acknowledged quietly. Every trigger pull left its mark. That's why I chose this life. I wanted to build something instead of just destroying it. His eyes swept over Drake's trapped men. But sometimes, to protect what you've built, you have to be willing to fight for it. The right way for the right reasons. Sheriff Mills stepped forward, his aged voice carrying clear authority. 5 years we've been preparing, learning to work together to protect our own. Every improvement to the town, every new defense, all part of something bigger. A trap, Drake realized, fury and desperation warring in his expression. This whole town is one big trap, not just for my men, but for your employers, Mason finished. Men who think they're too powerful to face justice, who'd never imagined someone might spend years setting up their downfall. His voice hardened. Men who are about to learn that no one is beyond the reach of true justice. Through the mirrors, Mason caught a subtle signal from Tommy. The backup plans were in place. If Drake and his men tried anything desperate, the town was ready. You think Durham can touch them? Drake's laugh held an edge of hysteria now. They own judges, governors, and whole territories. They'll bury any evidence, discredit any witness. Why did they send you to silence Carson? Mason asked quietly. Because they're so untouchable? Or because they're actually terrified of what might happen if the truth gets out? His eyes narrowed, slightly. Same reason they've been hunting Hawkins all these years, trying to recover that ledger before it reaches the right hands. The sound of approaching riders grew clearer, carried on the morning wind. Drake's head snapped up, hope flaring briefly before dying as he recognized the rhythm of the hoofbeats. Not his reinforcements, but something else entirely. You're wondering who that is, Mason observed calmly. Wondering if they're more of your employer's men, coming to save you. But you know better, don't you? You can hear the difference in how they ride. That's not hired killers approaching. That's law. Real law. Not the kind you pretend to represent. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting stark shadows across Elks Crossing's main street as Marshal Durham's men systematically disarmed and secured Drake's trapped forces. The commander himself stood in silent fury, his carefully constructed facade of authority completely shattered by the precision of Mason's plan. 5 years, Durham mused, examining Carson's ledger with careful attention. 5 years of preparation, of building trust, of making everyone think the judge had simply faded into legend. Got to admit, Mason, didn't think you had this kind of patience in you. Mason watched as Sarah Chen directed some of Durham's deputies to the hidden cache of evidence they'd been accumulating, documents, testimonies, and proof of the corruption that had plagued the territory. Man learns patience working metal, he replied quietly. Learn that some things can't be rushed, can't be forced. Have to let them develop in their own time. Tommy, finally emerging from his protected position, looked at Mason with newfound understanding. That's why you taught. That's all those things about metal and heat, isn't it? About how sometimes you have to wait for the right moment, the right temperature, before you can reshape something. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's weathered face. Smart boy. Been teaching this town more than just metalwork. Been teaching them about justice. Real justice. The kind that takes time, takes planning, but strikes true when the moment comes. Drake, watching his men being led away in chains, laughed bitterly. You actually think this changes anything? The men I work for, they'll just send others. Different names, different faces, same results. That's so. Durham's voice carried the weight of authority as he held up Carson's ledger. Because according to this, your employer's entire operation depends on people not knowing how it all connects, on keeping their networks hidden, their influence secret. His eyes hardened. But secrets have a way of coming to light, especially when someone's spent years gathering the right evidence. Hawkins, who had been watching silently, suddenly straightened as understanding dawned. That's why you let my gang come here, isn't it? Why did you reveal yourself as the judge? Needed Drake to think he had a chance to recover Carson's ledger and silence everyone who knew about it? Mason nodded slowly. Your brother's death was a tragedy, Hawkins, but it was also part of something bigger, a pattern of corruption and murder that needed to be exposed. His eyes met the former gang leaders with quiet intensity. Been tracking Drake's employers for years, watching how they operated, learning their methods. Sarah Chen spoke up from her position near the store. The modifications to the town, the reinforced buildings, the hidden passages, the mirror networks, they weren't just for protection, were they? They were preparing for this moment. Every piece serves its purpose, Mason confirmed, just like in metalwork. Everything connected, everything supporting the whole. He turned to Durham. The telegraph operators in the last 3 towns that were burned, they were your men? The marshal nodded grimly. Been building our own network piece by piece, gathering evidence, tracking movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. He gestured at the captured killers. These men, they're not just hired guns. They're the link between the corruption in high places and the violence on the ground. Drake's face showed a flicker of fear for the first time. You can't prove anything. It's our word against Carson's detailed records? Durham cut him off. Against the testimonies we've been gathering for years? Against the evidence of your own actions, witnessed by an entire town? His smile held no warmth. Face it, Drake, you and your employers just walked into a trap 5 years in the making. Tommy, who had moved closer to Mason, looked up at the man he'd known only as a blacksmith, with a mixture of awe and understanding. All those stories you told us, about metal and heat and patience, they were really about justice, weren't they? About how sometimes you have to work quietly and slowly to make something right. Mason's expression softened slightly. Part of it, boy, but also about community. About how people working together, standing together, can be stronger than any force trying to break them. He gestured at the town around them. Every person here played their part, kept secrets, stayed ready, believed in something bigger than themselves. Sheriff Mills stepped forward, his aged voice carrying clear authority. That's the real difference between you and them, Drake. You relied on fear and violence, thought you could break people's spirits, make them bow to power. His eyes showed fierce pride, but you never understood what real strength looks like. Through his network of mirrors, Mason caught signals from various positions around town. Durham's men had secured the perimeter, ensuring none of Drake's forces could escape. The trap hadn't just caught the killers, it had caught the evidence, needed to bring down their entire operation. Your employers made a fundamental mistake, Mason said quietly, addressing Drake but pitching his voice to carry to all the captured men. They thought power came from killing, from destroying what they couldn't control. His hand rested on his forge hammer, the tool that had become as much a symbol of his new life as his gun had been of his old one. Never understood that real Power comes from building, from creating something worth protecting. Durham nodded in agreement. Been waiting years for this moment, gathering allies, positioning our pieces, making sure when we finally moved against them, it would be decisive. He held up Carson's ledger. This isn't just a list of crimes, it's a map of corruption. Shows how everything connects, how the violence and intimidation served their larger goals. As Durham's deputies led the last of Drake's men away, the morning sun cast long shadows across Elks Crossing's main street. The town had changed in ways that went far deeper than the visible preparations Mason had orchestrated. Something fundamental had shifted, a transformation forged in the heat of confrontation and tempered by shared purpose. "You know what happens next," Drake called out suddenly, his voice carrying a mix of desperation and dark promise. "My employers, they won't just disappear because you've captured us. They'll send others, different men, different methods. But the same result. Mason's response was to pick up a piece of raw iron from near his forge. "Interesting thing about metal," he said, turning the unworked material in his weathered hands. "In its raw state, it seems unchangeable, stubborn, set in its way." With practiced ease, he thrust the iron into his forge's glowing heart. But with the right heat, the right pressure, applied at the right moment, the assembled crowd watched as he withdrew the now glowing metal, shaped it with a few precise hammer strikes, then plunged it into water. Steam hissed like angry spirits as he lifted out a perfectly formed hook, simple, functional, strong. "Sometimes," he continued quietly, "what seems unchangeable just needs the right circumstances to reveal its true nature." Durham nodded in understanding. That's what this was all about, wasn't it? Not just catching Drake and his killers, but creating the circumstances needed to reshape something larger. Tommy, watching from near his mother's side, spoke up eagerly. "Like how you taught us that metal remembers its working, how each hammer blows, each heating and cooling becomes part of its new shape." "Smart boy," Mason acknowledged with a slight smile. "Been teaching this town more than just metalwork. Been teaching them about transformation, how people like metal can become something stronger when they work together, when they face fire and pressure as one." Sarah Chen stepped forward, her rifle still held ready despite Drake's capture. "That's why you chose Elks Crossing, isn't it? Not just because it was remote, but because you saw something here, something that could be shaped into something stronger. Saw people who understood the value of community," Mason confirmed, "who knew that standing together was more important than standing alone." His eyes swept the gathered townspeople, each one now revealed as a crucial part of his years-long plan. Saw the potential for something that Drake's employers couldn't understand, couldn't control. Sheriff Mills, his aged frame straight with pride, gestured at the town around them. Every improvement, every modification, every new defense, they weren't just about protection. They were about building something larger, something that could stand as an example. "An example of what?" Drake sneered, though his voice held a tremor of uncertainty. "How did one town get lucky? Of how a legendary gunfighter played builder for a few years." "An example of justice," Durham replied firmly. "Real justice, not the kind you and your employers have been perverting." He held up Carson's ledger. "This evidence, combined with what Mason and this town have gathered over the years, it doesn't just expose your immediate crimes. It reveals the entire system of corruption you've been serving." Through his network of mirrors, Mason caught signals from the town's outskirts, more riders approaching, but these wore the badges of legitimate law enforcement from neighboring territories. Just as he'd planned, the web was spreading, catching more than just Drake's immediate force. "Your employers made a crucial mistake," Mason said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 5 years' patience. "They thought fear was their greatest weapon, though if they burned enough towns, killed enough families, people would be too frightened to stand against them." Hawkins, who had been watching silently, suddenly straightened with understanding. But fear only works if people feel alone, if they think they have to face it individually. Exactly. Mason's approval was evident. Man working alone can bend. Under pressure, break under heat, but people working together. He gestured at the town around them, at the hidden defenses and carefully prepared positions that had trapped Drake's forces. Together, they become something stronger, something unbreakable. Sarah Chen's voice carried clear across the morning air. Like how you taught us that the strongest metal isn't always the purest. How different elements working together create. Something stronger than any single piece could be alone. The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone present. Each member of the town had played their part. From Tommy's signal work to the shopkeepers who had helped maintain their cover story, from the telegraph operator who had coded messages to Durham to the stable hands who had reported on suspicious travelers. Been watching your operation for years, Mason continued, addressing Drake but pitching his voice to carry to all the captured men. Watching how you moved, how you chose your targets, learning your patterns, your weaknesses. His eyes hardened slightly. And all that time I've been teaching this town how to be more than just another target. The news spread across the territory like wildfire in dry grass, not just of Drake's capture, but of how a remote town had stood against corruption and won. Within days, riders began appearing on Elk's Crossing's horizon, but these weren't threats or outlaws. They were representatives from other communities coming to see for themselves the town that had helped bring down one of the territory's most powerful criminal networks. Third group this morning, Sheriff Mills observed, watching another delegation. Ride in. Folk from Silver Peak this time. Heard they'd been having similar troubles with men claiming false authority. Mason worked his forge as he had every morning, the rhythm of hammer on anvil, providing a steady counterpoint to the town's increased activity. But now there was no pretense about his true identity. The judge had emerged from hiding, transformed, but not diminished by his years of building rather than destroying. They're not just coming to hear about Drake's capture, Sarah Chen observed from her store's entrance. They want to learn how we did it. How we built something strong enough to stand against men like him. Through his network of mirrors, Mason watched the newcomers' reactions as they took in the town's subtle defenses, its hidden strengths. Their expressions showed the same journey from skepticism to understanding that he'd seen in every delegation so far. "Mr. Blackwood," Tommy called out, emerging from the telegraph office with a stack of messages. "Got more requests for information about your metalworking techniques, but they're not just asking about regular smithing. They want to know about community building too." A ghost of a smile touched Mason's weathered face as he shaped a piece of glowing iron. "Natural connection there, boy. Both require understanding how different elements work together, how pressure and heat can either strengthen or destroy, depending on how they're applied." Durham, who had remained in town to coordinate the broader investigation, approached the forge with purpose. Words spreading faster than we anticipated. Not just about Drake's capture, but about what you've built here. About how a community can protect itself without relying on guns and violence. "That was always the real goal, wasn't it?" Hawkins asked, his voice carrying new understanding. The former gang leader had chosen to stay in Elk's Crossing, finding purpose in helping other towns learn what this one had taught him. Not just stopping Drake and his employers, but showing people there's another way. Mason set down his hammer, examining the piece he'd just shaped, a reinforced hinge for the church door, both beautiful and strong. "After Thunder Canyon, I realized something important. World doesn't need more legends about fast guns and deadly accuracy. I need examples of how to build something lasting." The morning sun caught the metal dust in the air, making it sparkle like tiny stars around Mason's forge. Each mote carried its own story, of heat and pressure, of transformation, of finding strength through change. "Been thinking about what you said," Billy called down from his position in the church tower. The young man who had once ridden with Hawkins' gang had found his own transformation, becoming one of the town's most reliable defenders. About how the strongest metal isn't always the purest, but the one that's been worked right, mixed with other elements to make something better. Mason nodded in approval. Same principle applies to communities. Town that stands alone, refuses to change or adapt. That town's brittle, vulnerable. He gestured at the diverse group of visitors gathering in the street. But a town that learns to work with others, to share strength and knowledge, that's like properly forged steel, flexible enough to bend under pressure, strong enough to hold its shape. Sarah Chen stepped forward, her rifle now worn openly but comfortably, not as a threat, but as a symbol of readiness to defend what mattered. That's what these people are really coming to learn, isn't it? Not just about defenses and tactics, but about how to build something worth protecting. Through his mirrors, Mason caught glimpses of the town's transformation in action, where once people had hurried about their business, heads down and fearful. Now they walked with purpose and pride. Each person knew their role, understood their part in the larger whole. Your employers never understood this, Mason said quietly to Drake, who was being held in the reinforced jail until Durham's full force could transport him to face justice. They thought power came from making people feel helpless, from burning and destroying anything they couldn't control. The captured commander laughed bitterly. And you think teaching a few towns to resist will change that? The territory's too big, too wild. There will always be men willing to use violence to take what they want. Maybe so, Mason acknowledged, but his voice carried quiet certainty. But now there'll be communities that know how to stand against them. Towns that understand strength aren't just about guns and guards, but about people working together. Support each other. Durham, who had been listening thoughtfully, spoke up, already seeing the effects. 3 towns in the Northern Territory successfully drove off raiders last week. Used techniques they'd learned from your example, not just the physical defenses, but the way you've organized people to work together. Evening settled over Elk's Crossing like a gentle blanket, the last rays of sunlight catching on Mason's forged smoke as it spiraled into the darkening sky. Most of the visitors had departed, carrying with them not just knowledge of defenses and strategies, but a deeper understanding of what made a community truly strong. Strange day, Tommy observed, helping Mason organize his tools as he had every evening for the past 5 years. But now the boy's movements showed new purpose, new understanding. Seeing all those people coming to learn, not to fight. Coming to build, not destroy. Mason smiled slightly, noting how Tommy unconsciously mimicked his precise movements, his careful attention to detail. Reminds me of something your father once told me, back when I first arrived. Said a man's legacy isn't in what he can tear down, but in what he helps others build. Sarah Chen approached the forge, carrying their usual evening coffee. But unlike countless evenings before, she now moved with the confident grace of someone who fully understood her role in something larger than herself. James would be proud, she said softly, setting down the cups. Not just of how you've protected us, but of how you've helped us grow, how you've taught us to protect ourselves. Through his mirror network, Mason caught the last glimpses of the day's activities, Durham's deputies securing the perimeter, townspeople making their evening rounds, Billy maintaining his vigilant watch from the church tower, each person moving with purpose, with understanding of their part in the whole. You know what I've been thinking about? Hawkins spoke up from where he sat, cleaning one of James Chen's properly maintained rifles. The former gang leader had found unexpected peace in helping maintain the town's defenses. About how different things might have been if Gabe had met you like this, as a builder instead of a legend to challenge. Mason's hands stilled briefly on his tools, the weight of memory, settling like forge smoke. Been thinking the same about a lot of young men I have faced. about how many might have chosen different paths if they'd understood that real strength isn't about who's fastest with a gun. Durham, who had remained to coordinate the broader response to the territory's changes, joined them at the forge. That's the real transformation we're seeing, isn't it? Not just in how towns defend themselves, but in how people think about strength and justice. Most folks, Mason replied, returning to his work with practiced ease, they've been taught that power comes from what you can destroy, how many you can frighten, how much you can control. His hands moved with precise care as he arranged his tools. Takes time to learn that real power comes from what you can build, what you can create together. Tommy, watching Mason's movements with studied attention, spoke up eagerly. Like how you taught us that the strongest chains aren't the heaviest ones, but the ones where each link supports the others perfectly. Smart boy, Mason acknowledged with genuine pride. Been watching you learn more than just metalwork these past years. Been watching you understand how things connect, how people can work together to create something stronger than any individual could manage alone. A rider approached from the darkening street. Not a threat or messenger, but one of the townspeople returning from patrol. They moved with quiet confidence, understanding their role in the larger pattern of the town's defense. You've changed more than just Elk's Crossing, Durham observed thoughtfully. What you've built here, what you've taught, it's spreading, changing how people think about protecting themselves, about building community. Sarah nodded in agreement, already seeing it in how traders talk about different towns. Used to be they'd warn about where was dangerous, where to avoid. Now they're sharing stories about communities standing together, about people helping each other grow stronger. Mason's slight smile carried decades of hard-earned wisdom. Man learns things working metal, about how what seems fixed can be reshaped, about how what seems broken can be made whole again. His eyes swept over the gathering. Same principles apply to people, to communities, to the whole territory if given the chance. Through the mirrors, he caught glimpses of the town's evening routine, lights appearing in windows, families gathering for meals, guards taking their positions with quiet purpose. Each action part of a larger whole, each person understanding their role in maintaining what they'd built together. Tell me something, Hawkins said suddenly, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. All those years ago, when you first came here, did you already have this planned? Did you see what this town could become? Mason considered the question as he worked, his movements never faltering. Saw potential, he admitted quietly. Saw people who understood the value of community, even if they didn't yet know their own strength. Saw a place that could become something more than just another target for men like Drake. Evening settled over Elk's Crossing like a gentle blanket. The last rays of sunlight catching on Mason's forge, smoke as it spiraled into the darkening sky. Most of the visitors had departed, carrying with them not just knowledge of defenses and strategies, but a deeper understanding of what made a community truly strong. Strange day, Tommy observed, helping Mason organize his tools as he had every evening for the past 5 years. But now the boy's movements showed new purpose, new understanding, seeing all those people coming to learn, not to fight, coming to build, not destroy. Mason smiled slightly, noting how Tommy unconsciously mimicked his precise movements. His careful attention to detail reminds me of something your father once told me back when I first arrived. Said a man's legacy isn't in what he can tear down, but in what he helps others build. Sarah Chen approached the forge, carrying their usual evening coffee. But unlike countless evenings before, she now moved with the confident grace of someone who fully understood her role in something larger than herself. James would be proud, she said softly, setting down the cups. Not just of how you've protected us, but of how you've helped us grow. how you've taught us to protect ourselves." Through his mirror network, Mason caught the last glimpses of the day's activities. Durham's deputies securing the perimeter, townspeople making their evening rounds, Billy maintaining his vigilant watch from the church tower, each person moving with purpose, with understanding of their part in the whole. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Hawkins spoke up from where he sat, cleaning one of James Chen's properly maintained rifles. The former gang leader had found unexpected peace in helping maintain the town's defenses. About how different things might have been if Gabe had met you like this, as a builder, instead of a legend to challenge. Mason's hands stilled briefly on his tools, the weight of memory, settling like forge smoke. "Been thinking the same about a lot of young men I have faced, about how many might have chosen different paths if they'd understood that real strength isn't about who's fastest with a gun." Durham, who had remained to coordinate the broader response to the territory's changes, joined them at the forge. "That's the real transformation we're seeing, isn't it? Not just in how towns defend themselves, but in how people think about strength and justice." "Most folks," Mason replied, returning to his work with practiced ease, "they've been taught that power comes from what you can destroy, how many you can frighten, how much you can control." His hands moved with precise care as he arranged his tools. "Takes time to learn that real power comes from what you can build, what you can create together." Tommy, watching Mason's movements with studied attention, spoke up eagerly. "Like how you taught us that the strongest chains aren't the heaviest ones, but the ones where each link supports the others perfectly." "Smart boy," Mason acknowledged with genuine pride. "Been watching you learn more than just metalwork these past years. Been watching you understand how things connect, how people can work together to create something stronger than any individual could manage alone." A rider approached from the darkening street. Not a threat or messenger, but one of the townspeople returning from patrol. They moved with quiet confidence, understanding their role in the larger pattern of the town's defense. "You've changed more than just Elk's Crossing," Durham observed thoughtfully. "What you've built here, what you've taught, it's spreading, changing how people think about protecting themselves, about building community." Sarah nodded in agreement, already seeing it in how traders talk about different towns. Used to be, they'd warn about where was dangerous, where to avoid. Now they're sharing stories about communities standing together, about people helping each other grow stronger. Mason's slight smile carried decades of hard-earned wisdom. Man learns things, working metal, about how what seems fixed can be reshaped, about how what seems broken can be made whole again. His eyes swept over the gathering. Same principles apply to people, to communities, to the whole territory, if given the chance. Through the mirrors, he caught glimpses of the town's evening routine. Lights appearing in windows, families gathering for meals, guards taking their positions with quiet purpose. Each action, part of a larger whole, each person understanding their role in maintaining what they'd built together. "Tell me something," Hawkins said suddenly, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. "All those years ago, when you first came here, did you already have this planned? Did you see what this town could become?" Mason considered the question as he worked, his movements never faltering. "Saw potential," he admitted quietly. "Saw people who understood the value of community even if they didn't yet know their own strength. Saw a place that could become something more than just another target for men like Drake." The evening air carried the scent of cooling metal and wood. Smoke, familiar smells that had taken on new meaning since the truth about Mason's identity had emerged. Each element of the town's daily life now revealed itself as part of his carefully crafted lesson in strength and community. "Been thinking about Carson's ledger," Durham said thoughtfully, accepting a cup of Sarah's coffee. "About all those names and dates, all those carefully documented crimes. He paused, studying Mason's steady movements at the forge. But what strikes me most is what's not written there. The stories of communities broken, lives destroyed, all because people thought they had to face these threats alone. Mason nodded grimly, his hands never stopping their work. That was their real weapon, wasn't it? Not the guns or the threats, but the isolation. Making each town, each person, feel like they were alone against something too powerful to fight. Tommy, who had been arranging tools with careful precision, looked up with sudden understanding. That's why you taught us so many different things, isn't it? Not just about metal and defense, but about how everything connects, how everyone has a part to play. Smart as ever, boy, Mason confirmed with genuine pride in his voice. Take this forge work, for instance. Seems simple on the surface, heating, shaping, cooling. But every step depends on understanding how things work together, how different elements support each other. Sarah Chen moved to stand beside her son, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Like how you taught us that the strongest community isn't the one with the most guns or the highest walls, but the one where everyone knows their role, where people support each other without having to be asked. Through his mirror network, Mason caught glimpses of the town's evening activities. But now he saw them through the eyes of his students. Each movement, each interaction, revealed itself as part of the larger lesson he'd been teaching for 5 years. Remember what you told me when I first started watching you work? Billy called down from his position in the church tower, about how a good watchman needs to understand, more than just what he's looking at, need to see how everything connects. Good memory, Mason replied, a slight smile touching his weathered features. Been watching you learn that lesson well. Not just about keeping guard, but about understanding your part in something larger. Hawkins, who had finished cleaning the rifle, spoke up thoughtfully. That's what Drake and his employers never understood, isn't it? They saw power as something you take, something you use to control others. Never understood that real power comes from what you build together. The evening shadows lengthened across the street as Mason worked, each strike of his hammer echoing with purpose. The metal under his hands took shape not just through force, but through understanding, the same way he'd helped shape the town's transformation. You know what I've been thinking about? Durham said, watching Mason's methodical work. About all those stories they used to tell about the judge, about how he could read a man's intentions before they even drew their gun. He paused, understanding dawning in his eyes. But it wasn't just about reading individuals, was it? You were always looking at the bigger picture, seeing how things connected. Mason's hands moved with practiced precision as he shaped another piece for the town's growing defenses. Man learns to see patterns, working metal, learn that what happens in one place affects everything connected to it. His eyes met Durham's with quiet intensity. Same principle applies to communities, to justice itself. Sarah nodded slowly, realization spreading across her face. That's why you chose to become a blacksmith, isn't it? Not just as a cover, but because it gave you a way to teach these lessons, to show people how strength and change really work. Partly, Mason acknowledged, but also because working metal teaches humility, shows you that even the strongest material can be reshaped with the right approach. That which seems unchangeable just needs the right combination of heat and pressure, applied with patience and understanding. As dawn painted the sky in shades of promise over Elk's Crossing, Mason stood at his forge, just as he had every morning for the past 5 years. But now, something fundamental had shifted, not just in how others saw him, but in how the town itself had been transformed by the truth of his presence. Word came in from the territorial capital, Durham announced, approaching the forge with purpose. Last of Drake's employers have been indicted, their networks falling apart as more communities stand up, more people come forward with evidence. Mason nodded slightly, his hands never stopping their work on the metal before him. Changes coming to the territory, Different kinds of changes than men like Drake and his employers ever imagined. Through his mirror network, he caught glimpses of the town awakening to its new reality. Where once people had hurried about their business with heads down and shoulders hunched, now they moved with quiet confidence, each understanding their role in something larger than themselves. "Been thinking about what you said," Tommy spoke up, arriving for his morning lessons with a new purpose in his step, "about how metal has a memory, how each working, each shaping, becomes part of what it is." "Smart observation," Mason replied, with genuine pride in his voice. "Same principle applies to people, to communities, everything we've been through, everything we've built together. It's become part of who we are." Sarah Chen emerged from her store, rifle worn comfortably across her back, as she prepared for another day of teaching other shopkeepers how to integrate defense with daily business. "James would hardly recognize the town now," she observed softly. "Not just the physical changes, but how people carry themselves, how they work together." "Your husband saw the potential," Mason acknowledged, setting aside his hammer to accept her morning coffee. "Saw what this place could become if people learned to stand together, to build something stronger than fear." The morning sun caught the metal dust in the air, making it dance like tiny stars around Mason's forge. Each mote carried its own story of transformation, of heat and pressure turning raw material into something purposeful and strong. "Marshall," a rider called out, approaching at a controlled gallop. "News from Silver Creek. They just drove off a gang of raiders using the techniques they learned here. No casualties, no buildings burned. The whole community worked together, just like you taught them." Durham's weathered face showed satisfaction tinged with wonder. "Never seen anything like it in all my years of law work. Communities that used to be easy targets, now standing strong. People who used to hide from trouble now work together to protect what's theirs." Hawkins, who had been maintaining his watch from a reinforced position, spoke up thoughtfully. "Makes me think about Gabe, about how different things might have been if he'd understood what you've been teaching us, about real strength, real purpose." Mason's hands returned to their work, shaping metal with the same patience and precision he'd used to shape the town's transformation. "Loss always leaves its mark," he said quietly, "like a hammer blow on hot iron. But what matters is what we build from it, what we choose to create from our pain." Through the mirrors, he caught Billy's signal from the church tower. More visitors approaching, more communities seeking to learn what Elk's Crossing had to teach. The young man who had once ridden with Hawkins's gang now served as one of the town's most trusted defenders, his own transformation a testament to the power of Mason's teachings. "You know what I've realized?" Tommy asked, watching Mason's methodical work with studied attention. "Every piece you forge, every repair you make, it's not just about making things stronger. It's about showing us how strength really works." "Go on," Mason encouraged, seeing the deeper understanding in the boy's eyes. "Like how you taught us that the strongest chain isn't the one with the heaviest links, but the one where each piece supports the others perfectly. Or how the best blade isn't the hardest, but the one that knows when to bend and when to hold firm." Sarah smiled at her son's insight. "Just like you taught us that a community's strength isn't in its weapons or walls, but in how its people work together, how they support each other, protect each other." The morning air carried the sounds of the town coming fully awake, not just to a new day, but to a new understanding of itself. The rhythmic ring of Mason's hammer provided a steady heartbeat to the activity, each strike a reminder of how patience and precision could reshape what seemed unchangeable. "Tell me something," Durham said, watching the town's coordinated morning routine with professional appreciation. "All those years ago, when you decided to hang up your guns and take up the forge, did you know it would lead to this? Did you see this far ahead?" Mason's slight smile carried decades of hard-earned wisdom. "Knew I wanted to build something instead of just destroying it, knew the territory needed more than just another legend with fast guns. His eyes swept the town that had become so much more than a hiding place. But this grew from the people themselves, from their willingness to learn, to change, to become something stronger. A group of children ran past the forge, playing their morning games. But now their play incorporated elements of awareness and cooperation that Mason had carefully cultivated. In the community, even the youngest members of Elk's Crossing understood their part in the larger whole. The real change, Mason continued, drawing a glowing piece of iron from his forge, isn't in the defenses we've built or the techniques we've developed. It's in how people think about strength now, about community, about justice itself. Sarah nodded in understanding. That's why Drake's employers failed in the end, isn't it? They thought they could control everything through fear and violence. Never understood that real power comes from what people choose to build together. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows from Mason's forge across the town's main street. But these shadows no longer held threats. Instead, they marked the passage of time, the steady progression of a community growing stronger through shared purpose and understanding. "Been thinking about Thunder Canyon," Hawkins said suddenly, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "About how different it looks now, knowing what I know about Carson and his employers. About how they used people's pride and fear to serve their own ends." Mason's hands never stopped their work as he considered this. "Thunder Canyon taught me something important, showed me that dealing with justice isn't enough if you don't also build something better to replace what's broken." His eyes met Hawkins with quiet intensity. "That's what we've really been doing here, not just stopping evil men, but creating something good in their place." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting golden light over Elk's Crossing as the town bustled with purpose. Mason wiped his hands on a cloth, setting aside his tools as he surveyed the progress of the day. The forge had been his sanctuary, his classroom, and his pulpit, and now its lessons extended far beyond the heat of its flames. Durham adjusted his hat, glancing toward the horizon where more riders approached. "Looks like we've got more visitors, more folks wanting to learn." Mason nodded, his gaze steady. "Let them come. The more people who understand that strength comes from unity, the harder it will be for men like Drake to rise again." Sarah handed Mason another cup of coffee, her expression thoughtful. "And when the next challenge comes, because it will, something always does." Mason exhaled, watching as the townspeople moved through their day, guard shifts changing with seamless coordination, traders bartering with respect, families working together to reinforce the town's structures. "Then we'll meet it," he said, simply, not as scattered individuals, but as a community that knows its own strength. A community that builds instead of just survives. Tommy listened intently, his young mind absorbing every word. "And if someone tries to break what we've built?" Mason set his cup down and placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Then we do what any good blacksmith does. We take what's broken and forge it into something stronger." The boy grinned, nodding in understanding. "Guess I better keep practicing then." Mason chuckled, ruffling Tommy's hair. "That you should, boy. That you should." As the town of Elk's Crossing thrived in the new dawn, its people stood not as isolated survivors, but as builders of a future where strength was measured not in destruction, but in what they created together. And at the heart of it all, Mason continued his work, shaping not just metal, but the legacy of a people who had learned the true meaning of power. The wind howled through the towering pines as twilight descended over the valley. A lone elk emerged from the tree line, its breath visible in the crisp autumn air. It hesitated, ears flicking as it listened for any signs of danger before stepping onto the worn path that led toward the river. Hidden in the underbrush, a pair of eyes watched the creature's cautious movements. Ranger Tom had been tracking the elk herd for weeks, noting their patterns as they crossed the valley. He adjusted his binoculars, marveling at the majesty of the bull before him. The creature was massive, its antlers stretching like the limbs of an ancient tree silhouetted against the fading light. The elk took another step forward, then stopped abruptly. It raised its head, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of something unfamiliar. Tom tensed. Something was wrong. The usual tranquility of the valley felt disrupted, the silence too thick, too heavy. Then, from the shadows, a low growl rumbled through the air. Tom's pulse quickened. A predator was near. The elk bolted, hooves pounding against the earth as it darted toward the river. Tom reached for his radio, but before he could issue a warning to his fellow rangers, a blur of motion streaked through. The trees, a wolf lean and hungry in swift pursuit. The chase was on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.